Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about study designs again and look at some of the tables that are associated with different types of study designs. Just as a reminder, we see this hierarchy of evidence. This is a pyramid that demonstrates the level of evidence in different study designs. At the bottom of the pyramid, we see the weakest designs, and then at the top, we see the strongest. Today we're going to be talking about some of the observational studies which fall right in the middle of this hierarchy of design. Later on we'll also talk about the clinical trials and look at some of the outcomes with clinical trials. So let's start with cross-sectional studies. A cross-sectional study is the type of study design where we're looking at a cross-section in time. In other words, we're looking at outcomes or asking questions or measuring things all at the same time, perhaps just in one day. So rather than following people forward in time to see what happens, do people get a disease or not, and rather than looking backwards, asking people, have you been exposed to this or that, we're looking at everything all at the same time. So graphically we can see it like this, where you see the three different groups are all compared at the same time. So again, we're not moving forward in time with these groups. We're not asking about looking back or assessing data from the past to see how they ended up in these groups. We're just assessing them right now. In this study, this is a table from a study looking at two different refugee groups that have PTSD and asking these two different groups what factors they thought were associated with their getting PTSD. And so in this study, what we see is that there are some differences in the outcomes as to what social or environmental factors they think might be associated with their PTSD. For example, we see that coming from a war-torn country and experiencing a traumatic event are the two pretty much highest categories in both Afghan refugees and Iraqi refugees. But there are some differences in terms of moving to a new country or having family problems. There seems to be a difference of opinion between these two groups as to whether those factors affected their development of PTSD or not. One thing I want to point out in this table is that we don't see any p-values. There wasn't any inferential statistics comparing the outcomes of the two different groups. Sometimes in cross-sectional studies we will see p-values, but sometimes not. These are lower level studies, cross-sectional, and so sometimes they're purely descriptive, looking at the differences just in terms of percentages or averages or even looking at median numbers. So in this study, they did not inferentially compare one group to the other in terms of statistics. If we move to cohort studies, as you may remember, a cohort study follows people forward in time. So these are prospective studies, they're observational. And by observational, that means that we're just observing what people do. The researchers are not actually interjecting anything or randomizing people to one group or the other or mandating that they do, something versus another group that doesn't, get exposed to something. So in cohort studies, people are just moving forward in time and researchers are measuring different factors. Cohort studies look like this, where we have a group that might be exposed to something versus not exposed to something. Again, the exposure status is based on what the each individual chooses to be exposed to or is exposed to in their environment. So there's no randomization to exposure levels. And then people are followed forward to determine, who gets what disease or perhaps gets better, or any type of incident outcome that happens over time. So people are followed forward over time. The exposure, the outcomes are all measured in a prospective manner. This table comes from a cohort study that looked at incident dementia versus no dementia. So these a large group of patients are followed forward, and in the end, they are looking for, as people move forward in time, they're looking to see who develops dementia and who doesn't develop dementia. Now, as they go through time, different factors have been measured. And so we see that there's a list of different characteristics or variables on the left-hand side of factors that they assess to see which factors are associative of developing dementia or not. So we see several different factors appear to be associated with development of incident dementia. And by incident, that means new dementia, new diagnosis of dementia. And in this table, they actually did look at p-values for the risk of dementia, meaning they compared the difference in the variable or the exposure factor between the incident dementia group and the no dementia group. And if the p is less than 0.05, then it was statistically significantly different between the two different groups. So one of the factors that they were interested in included B vitamins. In this table, they pulled out the vitamin B6, folate, B12, and instead of looking at these variables as a continuous variable, they divided them into quintiles. And so with quintiles, if we look at the first quintile, in each of these three different vitamins, we see that the first quintile is considered the reference group. So for each of these different factors, we see that as the quintile goes up, it's comparing that to the lowest quintile. And so for instance, if we look at the vitamin B6, Q1 means the first quintile, which is the lowest level of B6. That's the reference. And now Q2 is the second quintile, which is then compared to that reference. So we're looking at odds ratios or odds of developing dementia or not developing dementia as the amount of B6 goes up. And so if we look at Q3, that's the third quintile compared to the first. Q4 is the fourth quintile compared to the first. Q5 is the fifth quintile compared to the first. And we're really, at least in B6, not seeing a pattern with it increasing or decreasing. And so the final thing that we see here is a P for trend. That's a statistic looking at all of these statistics to see, is there a trend of it going up or of it going down? So if we look at the P for trend for folate, we see that that is statistically significant. And so the odds ratios are going down, meaning the more folate that an individual gets, the less likely they are to develop dementia. And so in these types of tables, sometimes we will see different models. So we have model 1 and model 2. So you might be wondering, well, what's the difference? The difference deals with how the models were adjusted. And you can see in the paragraph below the different factors that were taken into account in one model versus another. We will be talking about how models are adjusted in the future, but this is very common in tables that we see. And so if researchers want to account for different factors that are within the equation, they can adjust on certain factors and have different models with different factors included. We'll get to that soon. Finally, I want to talk about case control studies. In case control studies, we're starting with a group of individuals who have a certain disease, they're the cases, and a group of people who don't have a disease, they're the controls. And then we look backwards in time to determine why do some people have the disease and others don't. And so we're really looking retrospectively for factors that might be associated with the certain outcome of the disease versus no disease. So this is what the case control study looks like. And I just want to point out at the bottom we see the direction of the study. We're starting with the target population. We're pulling out some people who are diseased and some who are not diseased. And then we're going backwards in time and asking them, were you exposed to something or not? And so the direction of the study is retrospective. In this table, we're looking at, I continued along the same lines of dementia versus no dementia. And in this study, the two groups were decided at the beginning of the study. Instead of following them forward to see do they get dementia, they started with dementia. And the researchers looked back in time at several different factors as to is this factor associated with getting dementia or not? Is that factor associated with getting dementia or not? One of the things that they thought they might have discovered is that the amount of drug use, which indicates prescription use, that might lead to dementia symptoms or not, or be associated with, I should say. So when we look at this table, we're actually looking at the average number of medications that people who have dementia take versus those who don't have dementia. And it appeared that that was different. Again, in this table we don't see any p-values or indication as to what is statistically significantly different or not. They could have done that with this table and had an asterisk or something. But what they did at this point was, again, they pulled the data out, they looked at people who had dementia versus those who don't, and they graphed it, looking at, okay, for those who took less than one prescription, what percent of people who had dementia took less than one prescription versus of those people who don't have dementia, what percent of them take less than one prescription. And we see that there's a higher percent of people without dementia that take less than one prescription, and there's a lower percent of people with dementia who take less than one prescription. As we move up, we see that with 1 to less than 5 prescriptions, we see that the people who have dementia have a higher percent. And then when we look at 5 to less than 10 prescriptions, again, the people with dementia have a higher percent. And then greater than or equal to 10 prescriptions, we see that the people with dementia have a higher percent. And so again, this is descriptive outcomes. The researchers then will statistically analyze that. Here we're looking at odds ratios. And again, less than 1, this is similar to the quintile example, I should say. Less than 1 prescription is considered the reference group. And then when we look at the 1 to less than 5 compared to the less than 1, we see what is the odds of taking that many prescriptions in terms of having dementia or not. And so we're looking at, as these numbers are increasing, numbers of prescriptions are increasing, do we see a higher and higher odds ratio? In other words, indicating that there's a stronger association between prescription use and dementia. So this is the next step. And one thing I should point out is the parentheses, that's the 95% confidence interval. In this study, we can look at different types or different ways that the dementia was diagnosed, whether it be Alzheimer's dementia or other types of dementia. People can get dementia from things such as COPD or different disorders. And then in this study, they actually looked at specific comorbidities and whether the odds ratio was higher with those specific comorbidities, meaning different diseases, versus not having those specific comorbidities. So there are a lot of different study designs. There are a lot of different ways that researchers look at the outcomes of those study designs. We're going to continue looking at that, and we're going to actually start looking at how do you actually create these tables and calculate these types of outcome measures. So if you have any questions, please let us know.